We really needed the money, and everyone knew it. But the strange thing was that the only way to get it was to act like we did not need it at all. The plan was to seem relaxed, casual, and confident, as if success did not matter. That attitude ended up shaping one of the most unusual stories in music history. The Monkees went on to sell around 75 million records and even beat the Beatles on the music charts, something very few artists ever managed to do. Yet from the beginning, people said they were not even a real band. In 1965, Hollywood held auditions for what was described as 4 insane boys for a television show. The people chosen were actors, not trained band members, and most of them could not properly play the instruments they were shown holding on screen. What followed was fame on a massive scale, mixed with anger, confusion, and hidden achievements that were ignored for decades. By 1967, one member was so frustrated that he punched a wall with such force that it nearly hit someone's face. Another member later ended up in prison. And the biggest secret of all was that the man most often mocked as a fake musician later went on to quietly help create MTV, while the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame acted as if he never mattered. What really happened after the cameras stopped rolling was far more complex than the public ever knew. Davy Jones was only 18 years old when he stood on the stage of The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9, 1964. That night, he performed I'd Do Anything from the Broadway musical Oliver. Just minutes later, the Beatles walked onto the same stage in front of 73 million viewers, and Davy watched as Beatlemania exploded in real time. That moment stayed with him forever. Davy had already lived a difficult life for someone so young. His father had died in 1960, and Davy had moved from Manchester to London soon after. He had once dreamed of becoming a jockey, but those dreams ended, and at just 16 he landed the role of the Artful Dodger in the original West End production of Oliver. When the show moved to Broadway in 1963, he earned a Tony nomination for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. Even with that success, he was still just a working teenager, not a pop star or a household name. Standing backstage while the Beatles sang, he felt something change inside him. He later said that acting alone could never create that kind of excitement or mass devotion. That single night pushed him toward pop music, even though by 1965 he still had not had a hit of his own. Mickey Dolenz had started his career much earlier. In 1956, when he was just 11 years old, he starred in the television series Circus Boy under the name Mickey Braddock. He played Corky, the orphan boy who traveled with a circus and befriended an elephant. The show ran for 2 seasons and made him a child star. But fame faded quickly. By the early 1960s, the spotlight was gone. He was back in Los Angeles, appearing in small guest roles, studying architecture, and singing in a struggling bar band called Mickey and the One-Nighters. They played smoky clubs across Southern California, covering rhythm and blues songs for small crowds. Mickey carried his own equipment, drove home late at night, and sometimes made less money than he spent on gas. When he showed up to audition for the Monkees in 1965, no one cared that he had once been famous. The producers only saw a tall, energetic young man who could sing, act, and make people laugh. His past as a child star no longer mattered, but the experience gave him confidence and sharp timing in front of the camera. Peter Tork's life followed a very different path. He came from Connecticut and drifted into the folk music scene of Greenwich Village in the early 1960s. He played in tiny coffee houses like the Gaslight and Café Watt, earning a few dollars a night, sometimes only tips. Often, he slept on friends' apartment floors near Bedford Street. Music was not about fame for him, it was about honesty and tradition. He played banjo and 12-string guitar and believed deeply in what he called real music. He became friends with other struggling musicians, including Stephen Stills. When Stills auditioned for the Monkees and was rejected because of his hairline and teeth, he suggested Peter instead, saying Peter was a better-looking version of himself. At first, Peter refused. The idea of a commercial television show about a fake band went against everything he believed in. But by mid-1965, he was broke and out of choices. He bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles, nervous but hopeful. During the audition, he played guitar and cracked jokes, never realizing that the silly TV job he almost turned down would completely change his life. Michael Nesmith arrived with quiet determination and his own goals. Born in Dallas on December 30, 1942, he had been writing songs and chasing a record deal for years. Early on, he used the name Michael Blessing and released several singles starting in 1963, but none became hits. In 1964, he wrote a song called Different Drum, a bitter breakup song that went mostly unnoticed at the time. Years later, Linda Ronstadt's group, the Stone Ponies, turned it into a top 20 hit in 1967. By then, Nesmith was already famous as the serious-looking Monkee who wore a wool hat. Even while fans screamed for him, he struggled to be taken seriously as a songwriter instead of a comic TV character. What made it worse was that the show's producers had earlier rejected Different Drum, saying it was not suitable for the Monks, even though one of the Monks had written it himself. The Monks did not form in a garage like most bands. They were created in a boardroom. On April 16, 1965, producers Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider pitched a Beatles-style television show to Columbia Pictures. Rafelson had been trying to sell the idea since 1962, but it was only after the Beatles films A Hard Day's Night and Help became global hits that the studio agreed. By September 1964, Davy Jones had already been signed to a long-term Screen Gems contract, meaning one future Monkee was locked in before the band even existed. The plan was never just television. It was a business strategy. Screen Gems created Cole Gems Records so they could profit from music sales tied to the show. Long before auditions began, the money, marketing, and legal deals were already set. The band was designed to sell itself. In September 1965, casting ads appeared in industry papers asking for young singers and musicians aged 17 to 21 who were willing to play four insane boys. Hundreds of people showed up. Officially, 437 auditioned, and many more came without appointments. Stephen Stills tried and failed. Michael Nesmith was the only future Monkee who responded directly to the ad, even showing up with a bag of laundry, which the producers found charming and real. In the end, Davy Jones, Mickey Dolenz, Peter Tork, and Michael Nesmith were chosen not just for talent, but for personality. Davy was the charming British performer, Mickey was the wild comedian, Peter was the sweet and slightly awkward folk musician, and Michael was the thoughtful Texan songwriter. Together, they fit perfectly into a carefully planned image. Their contracts made it clear who was in charge. In January 1966, NBC ordered 32 episodes of The Monks. Screen Gems gave music producer Don Kirshner complete control over the songs. He chose the material, hired studio musicians, and approved every release. The Monks were hired to sing, not to play. Their first album went to number 1 for 13 weeks, but they had almost no say in it. Kirshner even released their second album without telling them, using a department store photo as the cover. They hated it, but legally they were powerless. When The Monks premiered in September 1966, it broke television rules. It used fast cuts, handheld cameras, and dreamlike scenes inspired by Beatles films. Each episode featured songs that worked like early music videos. The audience loved it. Their first single, Last Train to Clarksville, hit number 1. Their albums dominated the charts. In just 2 years, they released 4 consecutive number 1 albums and became one of the biggest pop acts in America. Behind the scenes, the truth was complicated. They did not play instruments on their early records. Professional session musicians handled the music while the Monks sang. Mickey was made the drummer for the show even though he was actually a guitarist, and he had to secretly take lessons so he would not be exposed. Michael Nesmith, who had written songs for years, felt angry and embarrassed being called fake. The tension exploded in 1967 when he punched a wall during a heated argument with Kirshner. That moment changed everything. After Kirshner was fired for breaking their agreement, the Monks finally took control. They went into the studio, played their own instruments, and proved they were more than a television act. What began as a manufactured band slowly turned into something real, shaped by struggle, pride, and a desire to be taken seriously. Michael Nesmith quietly took charge of the band, shaping guitar parts and arranging songs, while even Davy Jones, once seen only as the cute frontman, began working like a real musician, adding percussion and occasional bass instead of relying entirely on tracks recorded by session musicians for their 1966 debut. That spring, inside RCA's Hollywood studios, the band worked like a young garage band that had wandered into a major studio and refused to leave. Session logs show they would start in the early afternoon and go straight into the evening, sometimes working for hours without pause. On February 24th, they worked from 1 p.m. to 7:30 p.m., and in March they had marathon sessions from noon until midnight. Instead of layering polished tracks in isolation, they experimented live, testing sounds and arrangements as they went. Producer Chip Douglas kept the sessions flexible, allowing the raw edges of their playing to remain, which you can hear in songs like You Told Me and For Pete's Sake, with rough banjo fills and drum beats that sometimes push forward rather than sit neatly behind the rhythm. The resulting album, Headquarters, ran just under 31 minutes, but its raw energy and compact execution later made critics see it as the band's declaration of independence. Headquarters was released in the United States on May 20, 1967, and immediately found itself in a peculiar competition. Just days later, on May 26, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in the United Kingdom, followed by the US release on June 2, 1967. For part of that summer, the two albums competed directly on the charts, switching places as the top two spots, while teenagers argued in bedrooms over which album to play next. Records show that Headquarters sold over 2 million copies in just 2 months, proving that the public would buy a Monkees record even when the band itself actually played the instruments. Meanwhile, Sgt. Pepper went on to spend 15 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard chart in the United States and 27 weeks in the United Kingdom, positioning this television-created band as the commercial rival to what would later be called one of the greatest albums of all time. The success of Headquarters did not last forever. While it proved that the Monkees could act like a real band, their highest sales still came from the earlier, fully managed albums. In 1967, they achieved something no other act has ever matched: 4 number 1 albums on the Billboard 200 within a single calendar year. The Monkees, More of the Monkees, Headquarters, and Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited all reached the top, a record that still stands today. Interestingly, the most tightly controlled album, More of the Monkees, released in January 1967 with studio pros dominating the recordings, was also the bestseller. As the band gained artistic freedom and increasingly recorded their own material throughout late 1967 and into 1968, ratings and sales began to decline. What felt like victory inside the studio, a chance to play real music, turned into a business challenge, contributing to cancellations, lineup changes, and the eventual breakup. Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited, released on November 6, 1967, embraced a new kind of experimentation. The band was no longer only fighting for instrument and writing credits, they were exploring new sounds, even if that meant using studio help again. This album featured one of the first Moog synthesizers on the West Coast. Mickey DeLenz had seen a Moog at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, been fascinated by it, and purchased one for the band. Songs like Daily Nightly and Star Collector featured swirling Moog lines, replacing traditional keyboards and adding a psychedelic, futuristic feel. At the same time, they quietly brought in session musicians for support. Top drummer Eddie Ho played much of the drum work, while Chip Douglas directed sessions that blended professional performances with the band's own playing. The album became their 4th consecutive US number 1, selling more than 3 million copies even as rock music moved toward heavier, darker sounds by the end of 1967. Then came a radical attempt to dismantle their own image on screen. In late 1968, the Monkees helped write a film called Head, which premiered in US theaters on November 6, 1968. The script, co-written by a then little-known Jack Nicholson, was far from a teen-friendly comedy. It opened with Mickey DeLenz walking calmly across a bridge and jumping off, followed by a chaotic collage of war footage, commercials, and surreal sequences in which the band confronted the manufactured image that had made them famous. In one harrowing scene, screaming fans tear the band apart, turning bubblegum fame into literal horror. Columbia Pictures promoted the movie with a mysterious billboard showing only the word Head, hoping to spark curiosity, but the symbolism and non-linear storytelling confused their teenage audience. The film barely made an impact at the box office, and instead accelerated the collapse of the television and recording machine that had once created Monkey Mania. Meanwhile, the television show that had launched them faced its own decline. The Monkees debuted on NBC on September 12, 1966, riding the wave of youth culture alongside Batman and the British invasion. Initially, it fit perfectly with the zeitgeist. By the spring of 1968, the country was watching nightly news filled with Vietnam footage and political assassinations, and the show's slapstick comedy and quick musical inserts began to feel out of step. NBC aired 58 original episodes over 2 seasons, with the last new episode broadcast on March 25, 1968. Reruns filled the schedule until September, when the network moved on. Ratings had dropped sharply in the second season as viewers matured and rock culture shifted toward artists like Jimi Hendrix, Cream, and underground FM stations, while the Monkees continued performing 2-minute pop songs between skits. Behind the scenes, the band's push for musical control caused tension with the producers. NBC rejected their plan for a looser, more music-centered third season. When the cancellation came, the band still had hit singles on the charts, but their main platform, the television show that had sparked their massive popularity, was gone. No one felt this more than Peter Tork. By late 1968, he was only 26 years old, yet already exhausted from a relentless schedule of touring, recording, television taping, and the constant demand to stay goofy on camera. He wanted a band that could stretch out, jam, and experiment. Instead, he felt trapped inside a franchised pop machine that had gradually drained the joy from his work. The Monkees' story is a rare combination of manufactured fame and genuine talent. They began as actors playing a fictional band, initially relying on studio musicians and strict production control, yet they gradually evolved into real artists, learning instruments, writing songs, and asserting creative authority. Their rise, peak, and struggles reflect both the possibilities and the constraints of commercial pop culture, highlighting the tension between artistry and industry that countless performers have faced. Even as they tried to redefine themselves musically and resist the television machine that created them, they could not fully escape the forces that had made them famous, and the challenges of fame, business, and artistic integrity remained a constant undercurrent in their story. The combination of raw talent, ambition, and a willingness to push boundaries ultimately ensured that the Monkees left a mark far beyond their initial image as a manufactured teen band, blending pop success with genuine musical experimentation in a way few acts of the 1960s could match. After a grueling tour in the Far East during September and October 1968, followed by the exhausting filming of an experimental NBC special called 3 Revolutions per Monkee, Peter Tork made a dramatic decision. He chose to buy himself out of his contract, even though it still had 4 years remaining. Reports suggest he paid roughly $150,000 for each remaining year, totaling around $600,000, an enormous sum in 1968 that wiped out much of what he had earned with the band and left him nearly broke. News of his departure spread gradually between late 1968 and 1969, with some sources citing a formal exit date of December 30, 1969. Instead of waiting for potential Monkees nostalgia money, Tork walked away to form a new band called Release and worked on projects like George Harrison's Wonderwall soundtrack, seeking credibility even at the cost of financial security. However, life in the early 1970s was not easy. In 1972, while traveling from Texas to Oklahoma, Tork was caught carrying hashish. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 months in an Oklahoma state penitentiary. The man who had once drawn millions of viewers on Monday nights in the mid-1960s now spent his days on a prison farm doing manual labor. The contrast with the screaming crowds of just 5 years earlier could not have been starker. After his release, he did not return to television stardom. He moved to Marin County, California, joined a 35-voice community choir, and played guitar in a small shuffle blues band called Oyola. To make ends meet, he worked day jobs, including teaching at a private school. The teen idol had been replaced by a working musician quietly trying to rebuild his life after fame, legal troubles, and personal struggles. Meanwhile, Michael Nesmith made a very different gamble. In mid-1969, as the glow from the television years faded, he walked into RCA Records with an unusual proposal. He wanted to release country rock albums featuring pedal steel guitar under the name The First National Band. Between 1970 and 1971, he released 3 albums: Magnetic South, Loose Salute, and Nevada Fighter long before the Eagles made country rock a stadium-level sound. Commercially, these albums did not reach the heights of Monkees records. The single Joanne only made it to number 21 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1970, and Silver Moon stalled at number 42. Audiences who had once driven their records to number 1 had largely moved on. Yet critics later recognized these albums as early blueprints for country rock. On stage, Nesmith sometimes begged MCS not to mention his Monkees past, but fans inevitably shouted for Last Train to Clarksville, a reminder that his history was never far behind. While Nesmith struggled to sell a few 100,000 records, his family fortunes quietly gave him an unusual advantage. His mother, Bet Nesmith Graham, had created liquid paper in the 1950s, originally called Mistakeout, mixing tempera paint at her kitchen table to cover typing errors. By 1968, she owned a Dallas headquarters and an automated plant, producing roughly 1 million bottles annually. By 1979, she sold the company to Gillette for at least $47.5 million in cash and stock, dying the following year at just 56. Nesmith reportedly inherited a substantial portion of that fortune, providing him with financial security that his former bandmates did not have. This cushion allowed him to experiment with video projects that might have been impossible for others. By 1981, instead of diving into a Monkees reunion, Nesmith was creating innovative video work. He produced Elephant Parts, a 1-hour program made up of 41 short segments combining music videos, comedy sketches, and surreal mini-commercials. Songs like Cruisin' and Rio were presented alongside absurd and humorous content, designed specifically for the emerging home video market on VHS, Betamax, and Laserdisc. That same year, the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences introduced its first category for music videos, and Elephant Parts won the very first Grammy Award for Video of the Year, beating traditional television specials and concert recordings. The man once dismissed as a fake television musician had now earned the first Grammy ever awarded for a medium that would dominate the next 2 decades. Even before Elephant Parts, Nesmith had laid the groundwork for what became MTV. In 1980, through his company Pacific Arts, he created Pop Clips for Nickelodeon, a half-hour show featuring back-to-back music videos connected by brief host introductions. The format was simple but revolutionary, anticipating the visual language of 24-hour music television. Warner Cable quickly recognized the potential and purchased the concept, expanding it into a full-time channel built entirely around music videos. Nesmith chose a clean sale rather than ongoing involvement, and on August 1, 1981, MTV launched with Video Killed the Radio Star as its first video. The channel's format mirrored Pop Clips, with short visual narratives and host segments linking videos, demonstrating Nesmith's influence even when his name was not mentioned. As artists like Michael Jackson and Madonna invested heavily in music videos, Nesmith's pioneering work was increasingly recognized as the foundation of MTV and the modern music video era. Ironically, 1/4 of a band once labeled manufactured had helped define a visual language that made countless rock acts appear larger than life. In 1986, a scheduling decision at MTV unexpectedly revived the Monkees themselves. The network ran nearly 24 hours of Monkees episodes from 1966 to 1968 during a Pleasant Valley Sunday marathon celebrating the show's 20th anniversary. Teenagers who had never been born during the original broadcasts suddenly discovered the band, watching the 4 Beatles-inspired performers tumble across screens to hits like Last Train to Clarksville and I'm a Believer. Ratings were surprisingly strong, prompting Mickey Dolenz, Davy Jones, and Peter Tork to announce a 20th anniversary tour starting in June 1986. They played state fairs and arenas in cities like Denver, Detroit, and Los Angeles, drawing crowds of 10,000 to 20,000. Nesmith mostly stayed out of the tour, focused on his Pacific Arts projects, though he did appear once at the Greek Theatre in Los Angeles for a symbolic reunion. Suddenly, the once-dismissed television band was selling out venues again in the era of synthesizers and big hair. However, the reunion years were not without conflict. Touring opened old arguments about ownership and creative rights. Dolenz, Jones, and Tork performed as the Monkees, but the legal rights to the name belonged to corporate owners tied to Columbia Pictures and later Rhino. The band members had to license their own name to tour, and fans argued over which lineup constituted the real Monks, the original four, the reunion trio, or whoever happened to be on stage at the time. Meanwhile, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which opened in 1986, never inducted them. Although the Monks became eligible in 1991, they have been skipped every year since. Journalists and insiders often point to co-founder Ahmet Ertegun as a key obstacle, who allegedly rejected the idea because the band began with a casting call rather than forming organically in a garage. The irony is clear: countless acts already in the hall, from polished 1960s vocal groups to 1990s pop stars, relied on professional songwriters and studio musicians just as the Monks had. Yet the manufactured label stuck, making them the most famous omission in hall history. Fans responded with numbers. The Monks sold over 75 million records worldwide. Between 1966 and 1967, they spent 37 weeks at #1 on the US album chart with 4 consecutive albums. At the peak of Monkee Mania in 1967, trade papers reported that their records outsold the Beatles and Rolling Stones combined in the United States. Nesmith later admitted this was exaggerated, but it reflected how massive their popularity appeared at the time. Their television show used fast-cut musical segments filmed like miniature short films, anticipating the style of 1980s music videos nearly 15 years before MTV existed. On Headquarters, they fought to control their own music, played instruments, and co-wrote much of the material. Many critics argue that this leap in creativity alone should have earned them a place in the Hall of Fame. Death did not end debates about the Monks' authenticity. Davy Jones died suddenly of a heart attack in Florida on February 29, 2012, at 66, closing the door on any chance of a full reunion. Peter Tork passed away on February 21, 2019, in Connecticut at 77 after a long battle with a rare form of tongue cancer. Mickey Dolenz and Michael Nesmith carried on long enough to announce a farewell tour in 2021. Nesmith, visibly frail, finished the final shows with Dolenz on December 10, 2021, only weeks before his death at 78. Mickey Dolenz remains the last surviving Monkee. For some, the Monks' beginnings as a scripted television band will always be a joke. For others, their records, tours, and experimental projects reveal a group that quietly blended television pop, experimental film, and self-directed rock long before the music industry fully understood the power of that combination. Their story is one of reinvention, ambition, and influence, showing that even a band created in a studio can leave a permanent mark on music, visual media, and pop culture.